We're
hmm
recording now. So, welcome to Small Things Brought Together. My name is Robin Love, and this is the ongoing series where I speak with artists about their creative process. And it's a long format version, meaning that we talk and we are not feeling constrained to keep it to sound bites where the invitation is to really dig in and explore some things more in depth. So I am very honored and excited to have with me today Jaime Permuth, who is a photographer. And I was thinking we have known each other for 25 years. So Jaime and I met doing the Artist in the Marketplace program at the Bronx
hmm
Museum of the Arts 25 years
Yeah. Oh
ago.
wow, wow.
And have and found a connection in our shared interest working with in community with
Mhm.
people. So for me, the conversations that we have had that I really value and call up again and again are around this idea of like how does an artist step into a community and gain their trust and
Mhm.
and and so that what you see in that community as beautiful and unique and worthy of bringing forward, uh, yeah, how do you gain permission to
Mhm.
do that? So Jaime, welcome.
Thank you,
Uh,
Robin. Mhm.
and I always invite artists to share a little about themselves in the beginning. And if there's anything in particular that you would like to share about your background, um,
Mhm.
yeah.
Well, I had uh, the strange destiny of being born a Jew in Guatemala. That's a very, very small number of people get born that way. Um, my destiny kept evolving to the point of me being now married to a Korean woman, which makes me the first Guatemalan Jew in the history of mankind to marry a Korean woman, and makes her the first Korean woman who ever married a Guatemalan Jew. Um, I wish my artwork was equally exceptional. So, but I work in a documentary style for the most part. It's not the only thing I do, but it's what I'm best known for. And I gravitated towards um, the idea of communities of people who live kind of on the margins, a little bit of outsiders, and who play by their own rules. I'm fascinated by that. I find it romantic, for lack of a better word, not to be mainstream, but to pursue a dream, for whatever reason that makes you feel like it's meaningful to be alive, that gives you a special direction. So I've traveled with the circus in Guatemala in the past. That became a book project called Tarzan Lopez. And I've done work with junkyards and scrap metal businesses in New York, which became a book entitled Yonqueros. Um, and that's probably what people know me for, is these long form documentary style projects. And I can talk about that as well a little bit later if you're interested in why I insist on the word style instead of out and out documentary. I live in New York City. I'm a faculty member at the School of Visual Arts and the Masters in Digital Photo program. And I also teach at New York Film Academy. Um, and I have twin boys who are 2.5 years old. And it's a perpetual juggling game, that you have so many things up in the air when you're a parent to young children, and you have to make a living and you want to continue onwards with your artistic practice. Um,
Yeah.
and That is my life in a nutshell right now.
There's no one simple answer in your life from like the get-go.
Mhm. Ain't that the truth?
And you also spent time living in Israel, did you not?
I did. So I grew up in Guatemala and I completed my high school. And then I left to study at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. When I was 17, I had a scholarship. I took advantage of it. I learned Hebrew for a year. And then I enrolled in studies in psychology and English literature. And when I graduated, I saved up some money and I traveled to New York and enrolled in a master's program at the School of Visual Arts. I I will say that that training in literature, particularly, has stood me in very good stead in terms of how I tell my stories. And I love going back to the idea of fictional devices that are common to literary works, novels in particular, um, in order to tell a nonfiction story. So I rely on those very powerful devices to carry a real world story forward.
Mm, I did not know that about you, but that makes a whole lot of sense because even recalling, which is sort of why we were in touch recently, a project that we did together as part of the Latino Festival at Queen's Theater in the Park, where you worked with some elders in the community at
Mhm.
Elmhurst Hospital, and I remember you brought in film and you brought in literature and I remember thinking to myself at the time, like, wow, Jaime's so kind of able to just fluently bring in these other things outside of, photography. Um, and I was amazed by like the level of sophistication of the group that you had, you know.
So many warm memories from that project that we did together. And I'll always be grateful to you for commissioning that project, that opportunity. I remember I relied very heavily on Garcia Marquez. And I was fascinated by a textbook that Marquez wrote for scriptwriters, for
Oh.
filmmakers, and on how to tell a story. And that was one of the texts that we kept coming back to. And then the others were fictional
Mhm.
texts by Garcia Marquez that I was interested in, particularly his autobiography, and how, in the prologue, it was mostly the prologue to that book that I want to share with the seniors who attended. He says, life is not what you lived, but how you remember it.
Hmm.
And so this was like a whole entry point into um, life experience and memory and the importance of telling your own story, and sharing it with others. And yeah, that was a really good case in point of how cinema or literature, creative writing, photography, they all come together, and it's not the exception, it's the rule. It's the
Mm.
rule for me.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about all the projects that we've talked about over the years, and we're going to look at some pictures in just a moment. I've always been struck with how you seem to have a knack for for inspiring a kind of, yeah, inspiring trust and a kind of openness. And I guess I never knew that. I don't know that I ever knew the storytelling piece was like such a conscious part of it.
Mm.
Um, I mean, and I don't say that, I guess I say that because I just think you have a very gentle presence that inspires a kind of openness. But yeah, I don't know, maybe
I
we
mean, you
can.
have to be curious, that's number one is you have to be curious going into a community and open, and I think just present in the moment. And having a camera is it's a bit of an obstacle to that, because there's a certain remove as well. So you have to be there, but at the same time you have to keep a certain distance to be able to just survey the situation with a photographer's eye. But you have to be present, and I think you have to be thankful and honest about your intentions. And if all of those things are there, if people sense that you're approachable, if they sense um, that your intention is to learn something from them as opposed to, represent them in your
Mm,
own way. I'm there to learn. I'm there for a kind of poetic truth that is just going to happen. The camera will show it to me. It's not going to be my mind that tells me what it is. I'll see it when I see it in my photographs. Uh,
mm,
but I know that the people are going to teach me something, that their life and their way of um, relating as a community to each other is going to teach me something that I don't know and that I need to understand about living. And that's why I go, because I want to be a better person. And it's a very different attitude than, let's say, being a journalist and parachuting into a place and then spending a week and coming to these conclusions, which then have to be kind of provocative in many ways, uh, to get instant attention on the news circuit.
mm.
So in a documentary project, which is something I love to do, you have all the time. You decide whether it's going to take a year or 2 years or 3 years or 4 years to complete that body of work, and you're working on your own for the most part. There's nobody directing you or giving you deadlines or putting pressure on you about how things should be you know represented. So
Yeah, I feel like that relationship, because that's what it boils down to, right? Is
mhm,
relationship. And
absolutely.
for me, I mean, I almost like what you were just saying, almost like makes me want to cry. It's so beautiful about wanting, you go there to learn and not
Mhm,
um, represent. It's
mhm.
couldn't be clearer, and it's funny, I don't know that I really would have used the word romantic about your work until I put the slideshow together, and I was like, "He is so romantic." And then you use that word. I was like, "Okay, I wasn't that far off then."
I, you know, I am a sucker for it. I mean, my favorite book is Don Quixote de la Mancha. Period. Period. There's no book that I like more than Don Quixote de la Mancha. So guilty as charged.
All right. Well, I'm going to share the screen and we will have a look at some of your images. As before we started the recording, I mentioned that I've picked out 3 of the projects. Um, 2 of them you mentioned already. So let's see. That's you. Okay. So Yonkeros. This project is very near and dear to my heart because of all the time that I spent working in Flushing Meadows, Corona Park, and which is right next door to this neighborhood in Queens, which I think has been drastically changed, right?
Mhm, that's right.
So I did change up some of the order from your website, so please forgive me. But I didn't put every single picture in, so I
Of
started.
course.
Yeah. So
You know,
maybe.
this
Yeah.
this is the first image in the book, so I I'll just say a few things about this photograph. I want, you know, I spent a year in Willets Point, where the action takes place, in the junkyards and scrap metal businesses. And it's just a train ride away from Manhattan, but it is a completely different terrain. It's hard to believe. It looks a little bit like a lunar landscape. It's it's so devastated in many ways. Um, but this is the first image in the book. And just to go back to this idea of storytelling, there's a few things I can say about this shot that might make that comment less abstract. I'm curious, Robin, what is the first thing that you see in the photograph?
The first thing I see is the Pepsi sign.
And you see it twice, right? You see
Yeah,
it
and then reflected in the puddle.
reflected in the puddle.
Mm.
When I first arrived in Willets Point, I felt like I had woken up in the Great Depression, in the Dust Bowl, in
Mm.
the middle of America, and that I was traveling back in time. And I think as an artist, it's okay to make those claims, but then you have to substantiate them somehow. You can be arbitrary about how you state things and how you feel about a place, but you still look for signs in the landscape. And that Pepsi Cola sign is not a 21st century Pepsi Cola sign.
Mm.
Is the font is vintage, and it's closer to 1950s than it is to 1920s and 30s, but it's still not that far removed. And so something in my mind said, well, okay, well, here's a sign that is there. I mean, the sign doesn't read correctly, it's flipped. And the reason for that is that it's meant for the audience that comes to see the baseball games at Citi Field Stadium, which is right across the street from Willets Point, and is the reason why the junkyards were doomed. The New York City spent close to $1 billion renovating that stadium, um, which which is where the Mets play. Is the old Shea Stadium that became Citi Field Stadium. And so this is the scene. This is all the way in the background is the reason why Willets Point is doomed.
Mm.
Now, this is the first image in the book, and the mechanism that I'm interested in here is the idea of foreshadowing.
Mm.
And how, I mean, I went there for a whole year. I have so many pictures of the main street of Willets Point, which the locals call the road to nowhere.
Mm.
I have so many images, but I chose this one because I went there very early in the morning and all the shops were closed. And in that sense, there's already a hint that everything is going to close here, that everything is going to come to an end. Um, so, this idea of the reflection, in Spanish, you have a word called espejo, which means mirror. And it's not so distant from a very similar word, espejismo, which means hallucination.
Mm.
And these are some of the things that that I'm thinking about when I edit the book, not when I shoot. It's not like I show up there and all of this is going through my head. I mean, I show up there, the light is a certain way, I choose a certain angle, and intuitively I feel that there is something there for me. But later on in editing and sequencing a book, you can really think more deeply. I mean, you can really, take your time and create a narrative for the work. So
Yeah, in a way, if the words were already in your head, then it wouldn't have the life. How could the picture have its own life if you've already narrated it,
mm-hmm,
before
mm-hmm.
you took it?
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. And I mean, at least that's the case for me, because there's even in documentary these days, there's a whole new direction in documentary that is staged,
Mm,
that goes even further in mixing fiction and reality, where some images are straight photographs and other pictures are staged, and they coexist in the same
mm,
um, aesthetic space. Um, it's a very interesting new direction in documentary.
mm.
I'm not really in that camp, but yeah. So I hope that maybe clarifies what I
Yeah.
started to talk about earlier.
Yeah. So when you say you went there for a year, I'm gonna proceed. So did you just show up one day with your camera or did you scout it out? How did you even land in this place that, unless you were trying to get your windshield replaced, I'm not sure why you would go there.
That's such a great question. So, I mean, I had been following the story of Willets Point, not in the front pages of newspapers, but in the back pages of newspapers, and I was intrigued. I was intrigued by this idea that there were junkyards and that there were mechanics who worked there year round. Because believe me, it's very different to work there in the you know dog days of August than it is in the
Mm,
deep freeze of February. And so this is really an amazing part of the city, and I've always liked parts of the city, and they're less and less, that are trade driven. To give
mm,
you another example, let's say the fashion district in Manhattan, like, or the flower district. Um, it's really fascinating to me that this is a part of the city that is dedicated to this trade, and that there's all kinds of stores that flesh it out. And so I was interested. I remember a beautiful day in spring of 2009. Actually, no, sorry, 2010, spring 2010, um, when the weather was beautiful, and I had been wanting to go out to Willets Point for a long time. It was not easy to get there from Brooklyn, so everything from Brooklyn has to go from Manhattan to get to Queens, and I was looking at an hour and a half by subway, and life is so busy, and I kept putting it off. Finally, I had a choice between staying in bed with my girlfriend at the time, or having brunch together, or going out to Willets Point. And I said, you have to leave because I'm going to Willets Point, or you can stay here and wait until I come back, but I have no idea what time I'm coming back. Um, and so I did. Like you said, I spent a day in Willets Point with my camera around my neck, but not taking any pictures, just talking to the mechanics and feeling out the chemistry, seeing, in a documentary frame of mind, you have to be very careful um, not to overstep your boundaries, and not to come across the wrong way when you're first approaching a community. Um, so I just wanted to hang out and talk to people, just very casual conversations all day long. And towards the end of the day, I did shoot a few pictures when I felt it was okay.
and I'm just imagining that in this community, which is its own world unto itself, as you've been describing, as I know, like the road, as you could see in the first photo, the streets were not paved. I don't even, where there was water or sanitation,
Hmm.
you
Open
know,
source, yeah.
services. But I'm guessing that just sort of like any small town anywhere, that like if a stranger arrives, like that by the time you spent the whole day there, everybody kind of had an idea there's some guy here with a camera. And I don't know, I made
Well,
that
that's
in my head. But
to a certain extent, that's very true. I mean, photographers sometimes are unaware that people notice them and that people wonder about their presence, and people check you out. They keep tabs on you. Of course, Willits Point is like the closest analogy I can think of is a Middle Eastern bazaar. I mean, people come in and out all day long. They have their cars and they want to get it fixed, and they have to ask, and they have to haggle for the price, and they have to find the right person to fix or give them the spare part. If you have like 1999 Subaru station wagon, your side mirror is broken, then there's somebody in Willits Point, or there was, because Willits Point is not there anymore at this as it was. Um, there's somebody who could sell you one, but you had to find that person. And if there was more than one person who dealt with Subaru parts, then you might want to bargain a little bit. You might say, well, or if it was something more serious, then that you needed something overhauled or fixed that was badly in need of service, um, you could get it done the same day. That was part of the charm. And part of the importance for working class families is that they could come in with their kids and hang out while their car was being worked on, and then hopefully drive it back home for a
Mm.
fraction of the price they would have paid in Manhattan. But yeah, I mean, there is a bit of that small town feeling about it.
Yeah, so people would have known that you were there. I mean, for me, this and this picture, these are intimate pictures.
Hmm.
You don't just walk up to somebody, and even if you could just walk up to somebody and ask permission, they don't give you what's being given here that I
Mm.
see in this picture being offered to you as the person behind the camera. Hmm.
There's so many stories. You have no idea, Robin. I mean, I'm not even going to go into the stories unless strictly necessary, because I would keep you here for the next 3-4 hours.
Yeah, yeah.
I will say something very short about this picture. This is the third time I photographed this man. And like you were saying, it's a trust game. So that the first time I photographed him, he gave me something in return. The second time I photographed him, I brought pictures from the first session. He trusted me a bit more. Then the third time that I saw him, it was really, you know, an open
Mhm.
kind of communication. I mean, at that point, he trusted me, and he knew who I was, and he knew that I was going to come back with photographs for him, and he knew that I had had conversations with him before, and how I responded or listened to his story. Uh, so this is the third portrait, and portrait number one was pretty good, but there was a better portrait waiting to be made,
Mm.
and I think that's the virtue of long-term documentary work, is that you don't stop at the first picture. You keep going, and you develop these relationships, and the way these relationships expand is the way that your photography grows, and that your vision becomes sort of more compelling along the way.
But as I think about what you've just said, and even some, my own work and communities, this requires stamina. And, I mean, to go back 3 times, not even just twice. And, you even took a risk to come back with pictures. What if he didn't like them, or,
Hmm.
and just what you were saying, like to be on the train for an hour and a half. I mean, come on, that alone takes kind of step.
Well, I, I spent the whole year in Willits Point, and I went at a minimum once a week, but if I could, I would go twice a week. Sometimes I would go 3 times a week, and I was just really fascinated. I mean, there's different kinds of projects that you can do, but this kind of project where the guys, are tough and muscular, and the cars are wrecked and rusting, and the landscape looks like the moon in what you expect to be the most affluent city on the planet. Um, and where Latin America is there so strongly, because most of these guys spoke Spanish, and so it was such a layered and incredible landscape, um, that I had to be there. I just had to go back. It was, for me, it was such a life experience, and I miss it. I miss the friendships that I made. I miss the place, even though the place was gross. I mean, your feet would sink in the mud, and the mud was not mud. It was a mix of toxic chemicals and open sewage. And because the city of New York wanted the junkyards to go away 40 years. I mean, the place had been there for 40 years. And the city of New York took away all the basic services. They stopped doing the sidewalks, they stopped doing the sanitation, they took away the cops. You do that to any neighborhood in New York City. Do that to the Upper West Side for a month, and you'll see what happens to the Upper West Side if you take away the cops and you take away sanitation and you don't give it maintenance. And so 40 years later, Bloomberg turns around, the mayor back then, and says, it's a blight. And in a quieter voice, he says, it's the next great neighborhood of New York City, right? So
Yeah.
I was there at the right moment. If I had gone there a year later, this would have been a completely different project.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. I mean, I was thinking about how your sort of varied cultural background has really served you in good stead because you can really blend in with a lot of people. Blend might not be the right word, but like you can navigate many cultures. You have navigated many cultures. Like you said, your very being is is that. So this one I find very touching because I have a textile thing, but there's for me
Mm.
the sort of tenderness of
Mm.
people's clothing in this environment is very.
That's such a nice reading. I mean, in the book, the opposite page is a busted soccer ball that is collecting rainwater,
I have that
and
one.
it's a. You have that one coming up?
Yeah.
Scroll through. Scroll through. Let's
Okay.
let's go to that one.
Oops, oh, yeah.
This. Okay, so these are the facing pages in the book, and the whole time that I was in Willets Point, I was fascinated by the sky, because Willets Point is on the landing route to LaGuardia Airport, and there's little airplanes that come down every few minutes. There's another airplane crossing your visual space. I was fascinated by the sky, but I was also fascinated by the ground, and I wanted to find an image where ground and sky merged, but it was impossible. And finally, I found this. I found this busted soccer ball, and resting on a cloud,
Mm.
and it was an image. I spent maybe 40 minutes making different variations of this photo, because I just looked for it so hard the entire year. And so I finally had it. I had it the way I wanted it. And then when came time to do the book, I felt this is too different from the rest of the material. This is way too symbolic. It doesn't fit in with the other images. And I thought I would have to sacrifice it. And that's necessary when you edit a project. Editing photographs is just um, like music. If you miss a step, if you're out of tune, then the whole spell of the sequence is broken, and you lose the trust of your audience. So I said to my wife, who is now my wife. Back then she wasn't, but we were already together. I said to her, I'm going to have to give this image up. And she said, actually, give me an hour with the photographs. And if you go back to the shirts, she said, this should be on the facing page. And it was such a beautiful edit on her part because for me, the tenderness that you were speaking about, they're almost like soccer jerseys. And soccer is the game of life in Latin America. And for me, this is the absent team. If the other image is about the precariousness of life and the impossibility of winning that game of life with a soccer ball that looks like that, then this is the absent team.
Mm.
Um, and so that was a beautiful edit, and I owe it to her basically. But
Yeah, well, we should point out your wife is also a photographer, very
yes.
skilled, talented. Yes. Yeah, beautiful. I do feel what you're saying about like that picture has a very different quality than all the other pictures. There is something about it. And even when I was just, you have 60 on your website, which I would highly recommend everyone run and go look at your website.
Thank you. Thank you,
But-
Robin.
and I was like, okay, I can't put 60 in. But yeah, but that one really does leap out, the soccer ball one. And it was when I was putting them together, I'm like, oh, it is really different. There's something different in this image
Hmm.
that from the others. And where does it fit? You know, yeah. So even in my little investigation, I feel that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Interesting though. Didn't quite make the same decision. Yeah. Well, I mean, I felt like there were some, obviously there were like portraits and then there were like the junk portraits, the
Mm.
cars and the pieces of cars and the stacks and the
Mhm.
stuff.
Mhm. If you look carefully, I don't know if you can see it. In grease pencil, everything is numbered. There's no computers as such in Willis Point, but there is a catalog. There is an accounting of every last little part in ledger books. It's old school. It's not digitized, but if you would see a print, you would see it very, very clearly. But every car there has a number in grease pencil, and everything is accounted for. And I mean, I think every project has a shape. The shape of this project has to do with the idea of the catalog. And if you read Whitman, um, you might be familiar with this notion when he, for example, enumerates all the different kinds of plants and flowers that grow in North America, and just one name after name after name after name after name after name. The more you read, the more you're overwhelmed by the bounty of what that represents. And so if you read Whitman, you understand that every catalog is a poem. And that's what I wanted um, to leave the audience with, the sense that Willets Point was a poem and that its catalog was an important catalog, that of course capitalist greed had to run out of the city. But we're not richer because of capitalist greed. And New York City is not even close to the city that I fell in love with when I arrived in the early 90s. Not even close. I mean, back then it was gritty and at times it was dangerous, but it was also full of wonder and poetry in a way that Starbucks and The Gap and TGI Fridays
Mm,
can never provide. And that's our loss.
mm,
We've done away with places like Willets Point or the Fulton Fish Market or the Coney Island. That became a developer's fantasy. They tore everything down. They brought that back selectively, the things that fit into the developer's agenda. I mean, it's just a crime to do that to the fabric of a city. But but that's the society we live in, you know.
Yeah, I mean that your line about the catalog is a poem, or every catalog is a poem, I think.
Hmm.
Yeah. Mm, yeah. Oh, so here's the winter.
Yeah,
Um, yeah.
I thought this is the way the book would end, with a whiteout.
Mm.
And curiously enough, going back to Garcia Marquez, which is apparently never too far away from my consciousness, I was thinking of the end of 100 Years of Solitude, which is one of the most beautiful endings in literature. And the last of the Buendia clan, of the Buendia family, dynasty, I should say, um, is in a small room trying to crack the code of an obscure book. And he's been poring over this book, trying to find the meaning. And finally, he's able to sense what the meaning is about, to start reading clearly the text. And as he reads, he realizes that death is right outside the door and about to overtake him.
Mm.
And that's the feeling that I had going to Willets Point. Um, this
Mm.
particular day was a storm, uh, just after Christmas or just before Christmas. I don't remember, but it was such a terrible blizzard that the 7 train was frozen in the tracks. People abandoned their cars in the middle of the boulevard. It took me like 3 hours to get out to Willets Point that day, and there were just a handful of mechanics who made it out. But I thought the book would end like that. It didn't, but that was my first that was my first and misconceived notion of how it would end.
uh, yeah, well, and so it was funny. It is funny though, because I thought, well, maybe I'll end with the snowstorm, but then I chose a different ending too. Sort of. Um, well, I actually I put these together as a bit of a series, and this one and the next two, which was
Hmm.
this, and then this, and then this.
Hmm.
The car, the
The
elevation.
cars, the cars in the sky.
Mm. And it is next to a highway where cars are in the sky, basically.
Yeah, that's a very significant highway then. Well, that's a story for a different day, but that whole
Yeah.
overpass, access to Willis Point, was what brought the whole place down. Yeah, it's the politics of that is what actually was the last piece in Bloomberg's puzzle to topple Willis Point, was securing an access, a highway access permit. Yeah.
Yeah. This was the one I chose to.
So, I mean, the book was meant to be a black and white book. And like I said, I thought it would be a whiteout. But um, this goes back to something I said at the very beginning, and is, as an artist, you can make assumptions and you can make arbitrary decisions, but then you have to live by those decisions. And so I thought that Blizzard would be apocalyptic and the end of things. But a few weeks later, there was a second and equally magnificent blizzard. So I knew that my ending was a false ending. And I
Mm.
knew that the world didn't end with that blizzard, it continued. So I decided to go um, out to Willets Point before sunrise. And I remember taking the train in the middle of the night and arriving there around 4:30 in the morning and standing in the snow until the sun rose. And it was a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful morning. Soft pastel colors over the snow, and it's a much more hopeful ending. Actually, this picture is the next to last picture in the book, um, and because of that fact that I wanted to include the sunrise over the snow, I had to reimagine the book, go back and include color much earlier on, include teasers before getting to the final sequence of the sunrise over the snow, because you
Mm.
can't have a book in black and white and then attach 10 pictures in color in the end. It doesn't work that way. So it forced me, the second storm kind of forced me to reimagine how the book would be shaped as a whole.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, even though obviously the neighborhood did meet its end, could not fight back the tide of Bloomberg um, and capitalism.
Hmm.
I mean, I guess I appreciated there's almost like a kind of dark humor in this image, and yeah, I think yeah, it comes through. It comes through, and I think I know the image that you did end with, and I decided not to choose that one and chose this one instead.
Hmm.
Yeah, because of there's
Well,
like a
this
yeah, this feels very
it
human
is.
and and
Uh-huh.
and like somehow the human connection that you make throughout the whole project feels like even though there's no people in this picture, yeah, it for me there's something touches that in this photo. So,
I'm amazed by your instincts because, there's the chronology of the book in terms of sequence, first picture, last picture. But that's not the same as the chronology of photography. So the actual last picture that I took happened months after seeing this. And so I had a book dummy for the project and had a pretty clear vision of what the project was going to be like if I managed to publish it as a book. And that was a big if, because it's tough. It's tough to land these contracts, and but I knew this was the next to last picture. I just didn't know that the project was finished yet,
mm,
and so I kept shooting until spring, when in fact, the whole year went by. And the last picture that I took was a picture of this same ice cream truck in warm weather. And there's actually two ice cream trucks. There's this one, and there's a guy with a push cart, and they're trying each other's ice cream.
yeah,
So, and they're
yeah.
having a little moment there. And when I took that picture, I suddenly, I realized that I said, I'm done. This is the end. This is the end of the project. That's the cycle. This has come around full circle. And what I wanted to do about representing the four seasons of the year had actually come to happen visually. So the last picture that I took is somewhere in the middle of the book. And if you're paying attention, my hope is that something will click. And by the time you reach this ice cream truck in winter, you'll go like, okay, I've seen an ice cream truck before. Oh, look at this. It was summer back then. Now it's winter. And you think about the seasons.
Yeah, yeah.
So you have very good instincts that which I knew already. But I'm not surprised at all about that. But you have very good instincts.
Mhm. Well, it definitely was really, I don't know, fun is the right word, but it was really great to kind of have my own experience of moving them around and playing with the, a shortened version of them. But
Mm,
mm.
it's a really nice edit.
So you tell me how much time we have left because I know I heard some
Some
children
rumor,
back
some
there
children's
for a
voices.
moment, but they seem like they've settled maybe again. So I wanted, this is one you also referenced earlier. And then I also have a shorter one third, but if we don't get to it, of course, that's also fine.
Hmm.
We can. Yeah, so in many ways, this feels like similar in as much as a project you really almost devote your whole life to, and you have to actually be in Guatemala to do. And um, I will just say that you and I had many conversations as I was being pulled to Newfoundland, largely because of family history, and you kept being pulled back to Guatemala. Well, you actually grew up in there, Guatemala.
Mhm.
Your family is there, but like this sort of question of like, why can't I shake it off? I don't know. That's how I often felt, was like, why is this place so compelling that I have to uproot my kids and basically ended a marriage? Like Newfoundland has paid, I've paid a pound of flesh to be here, but it's so
Mm.
compelling.
Mhm.
And I just remember it was always so useful to talk to you about your relationship to Guatemala and kind of like how it had a grip on you. And anyway, I was
Mhm.
thinking of that as I was looking at these
Mm.
images. So I don't know if that interests you to talk about a bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, I'll try to be brief, just in the interest of time. But Tarzan Lopez is the second installment in a trilogy of family projects with my father and my brother in Guatemala, who are both photographers, although they're also both lawyers. Um, so that they have a different relationship to photography than I do. I'm a full-time photographer, educator um, as well, but they are full-time lawyers. And so we decided to do a trilogy of family projects, and we gave ourselves 10 years to complete it. And in all fairness and all honesty, we completed the first two installments. The third installment is still waiting to happen. But the first installment was called Retrato de Familia, which it means family portrait, but it also means hyphenated retrato means to take again the idea of the family, to take it up again. And we were interested in that project to examine the very turbulent political life of Guatemala and the impact that it has on families and how, in turn, families shape individual destinies. Then, for the second installment, we decided to explore those same concerns in a family different than our own. So we knocked on the door of Guatemala's largest and oldest um, traveling circus, family owned traveling circus, Rey Gitano. And I ended up traveling with the circus for 2 years on and off. I mean, I would travel with the circus for maybe 2 months at a time as they made their way through the country. And then I would go back to New York and work some more and save some more money and then go back to Guatemala and travel another 2 months with them. I kept that up for about 2 years. And
There's that
and
stamina.
this is the yeah, stubbornness, stamina. I don't know what you want to call it. Romantic stubbornness. It's hard. It's hard not to follow that dream that I think suspect many boys have growing up, and maybe some girls too, of running away with the circus and living that life. Of course, I have no talents other than the photography, so I was no use to the circus at all. And I was often confused with the owner of the circus just because of the color of my skin, which was really sad because, you know, it's, I'm not the owner, I never was. But I traveled with them and I got to see Guatemala through the eyes of the circus. And historically, I grew up in Guatemala when it was torn by civil war. And at that time, the country was really, really fractured. And the only entity in the whole country that had carte blanche, a passport to travel freely, was the circus. It was the only thread that kept that country together in a way, in an impossible way. It was the only um, way out of that labyrinth of civil strife was the caravan, the circus caravan that was able to go freely, whether it was guerrilla controlled territories or government controlled territories. The mystique of the circus allowed them to travel and, become the organic tissue that held a country that was completely broken down.
Is that
Uh,
unique to Guatemala? You think that would be true in any other place?
I don't know how to answer that. I know that that was the case in Guatemala, and I know that there's other small circuses in other parts of Central America. Um, for instance, Costa Rica never had that problem. Salvador is a much smaller country than Guatemala.
Mhm.
Costa Rica is not a country that faced insurgency, guerrilla movement. Of you know, they just didn't because they don't have the same social conditions there. But it's getting very deep into politics. I would say that that it was true for Guatemala.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. So when you were growing up, you knew this circus.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah. And my when my father was growing up, he knew this circus. Although it was named, it had different names, but it was always the same family. So it goes back to the early 20th century to Irish Hungarian circus performer who fell in love with a Guatemalan uh, circus performer, and they started their own circus, and they kept it up, and they had children, they had children, they had children, and yeah,
Mm,
that's the tradition there.
it's amazing, yeah. So again, I messed with your order, but I think this is this the first one you actually have or second?
It's
Um,
close to the beginning.
yeah.
I think the first one is the ticket booth,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly, in the middle of a barren field.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, this is one of the trapeze artists.
This is where, when I was looking at these images, I started to be like, oh, yeah, the sense of romance and a kind of, yeah, and definitely feeling like your interest in the underdog and people who have been pushed to the edge.
Hmm.
Although the way you just talked about the circus, it sounds like even if they are transient, somehow they were not. They're actually like sounds like a thread through the middle rather than necessarily at the edge.
Yeah, I mean the first time that I encountered the circus, when we first talked to them, they were in Guatemala City, and in a completely surrealist turn, they were in the middle of the military complex called Campo Marte, the field of Mars. Um, and so on all sides, they had garrisons and fortresses and even cannons and tanks pointed at them, and they had circled their wagons like in a western. They had circled their wagons with their iconography, their roaring lions, their elephants, their clowns, and the counterpoint culturally couldn't have been stronger. you know um, they were right in the middle of the military complex because they rented the space from the military, um, but in a completely different vein and presence, than the rest of Guatemala. So there is a mystique about them, and they are seen as gypsies. They themselves see themselves that way. They consider themselves outsiders, and their names are exotic and fanciful. And
Mhm.
there's a distance for sure.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, leaving. They're running to the show.
Yeah. And the people watching and
This was a really beautiful moment because the entire audience that day was made up of women and children who had come from a small town together. They rented a bus, and they came to see the circus as a unit. and they were all wearing these beautiful woven watermelon dresses, and just the expressions, the look of wonder on their faces, I, it reminded me of how I felt as a kid going to the circus, and that's why I had to take the picture.
Yeah, well, I mean, it really does, like, oh, I don't know, with, of course, with the pandemic, and I just saw that and thought, oh, yes, I wish I could just look at something with that innocent wonder,
Mm,
feeling kind of weighted at the moment, but
right, or even without a mask.
yeah, right. Sit next to somebody in a crowd.
Yeah, that would be wonderful in itself, just that kind of sharing of public space.
Hmm. I have to say this one really touches me. Now I'm like, oh, of course it does, because it's like got fabric in it. But but there's something about, I put these very deliberately together, and it
Mhm.
is, yes, there's a curtain there
Mm,
as well, but there's like this longing,
mhm.
that you capture in a lot of your pictures also. Like,
And the fullness of the cloth is like her pregnant belly.
yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
a really good edit. I think I will hire you as an editor for my next project, Robin. What a beautiful edit that is. That's such an incredible edit. Wow. Blown away here.
Yeah, but that sense, I mean, maybe that is that longing, the pregnant longing of like what is to come. And yeah, I don't know. This one really.
Well, in her case, she was seduced by, I'm not going to say who, in the circus, and she ran away from her parents' home. And um, I knew that this guy didn't really care for her, but she was hopelessly in love with him and wanted to be a part of the circus and wanted to live in the circus. And for a while she did, for a short while she did. But
Mm,
she was so young, and she was so helpless and alone in that situation. She was carrying his child,
mm,
and she was so lonely in that place and so unappreciated.
mm,
Sad. That was a really sad story.
mm, mm. Yeah. Mm. This one is funnier.
That's where I slept. This was my bedroom, the cabin of that
Oh.
trailer truck. Yeah. So I would look out through the peephole, the camel's eye, to make sure the rhinos weren't around at night, so that if I had to take a pee, I could, step out. There, there was a hippopotamus there that hated photographers, and I was so terrified of that hippo, and they let it out at night to keep the compound safe from intruders, and it always was pretty close by to we're like waiting for his chance to eat my camera.
You sound like it really like had a thing. Was it the camera or something? Or
He hated the camera. The hippopotamus hated the camera, and he was fast and super dangerous.
I've heard they are, but that's really, really a funny story.
Yeah, there's a little bed behind the driver's seat in these tractor trailers, and that's where I slept. That's how I lived. I mean, every few days I would check into a hotel for one night, take a shower. Like I would shower once every 3-4 days, and I never shaved, and I would just recharge my electronics at the hotel and then rejoin the circus the next morning. I looked like a rustabout. I looked just like one of them.
Yeah. Wow. Oops. Wait a minute. Did I miss? Oh, yeah. This is beautiful. Beautiful portrait. I wasn't sure what the ring was, but clearly she is very proud of it.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, so many stories, but let's skip the stories.
Okay.
We're running out of time.
Yeah, so the last one is shorter, much shorter, but for me I chose it because I actually feel like this project for me is almost kind of as a like I am never going to travel with a Guatemalan family circus ever in my whole life. And this project also feels just equally sort of out of any realm of possibility
Mm,
that I would ever have.
mm,
That community is closed off.
mhm,
And I guess that's what I was thinking about. Your ability to navigate through different cultures and communities is so impressive.
mm,
And I have a fascination with very religious communities where
mhm,
it's sort of not this thing you do on Sunday, but it's this, or Saturday, it's the thing you do, it's the clothes you wear, it's your entire family, it's the air you breathe, the food you eat. Um, and to get a glimpse that I don't know who gets to have that glimpse,
mm,
is always for me, very fascinating. So,
mm.
mm,
Um, yeah, I mean, this is a project that is very close to my heart. It happened in the days after September 11, 2001. And if you can think back to the political discourse, it was George Bush was painting a picture that was either absolute good or absolute evil. And so the firefighters and the cops were the heroes, and the terrorists were the villains, and there was no ground in between. And when you speak about absolutes, that's the language of religion. So it made me wonder if there was a possibility of tolerance within Orthodox Judaism. Judaism is my own religion, so I felt that it was okay for me to look at this story, that it belonged to me in some essential way. Um, and I started to look out for this structure of tolerance, and I found this very interesting mechanism, which is called mincha. It's the afternoon prayer. And what mincha requires of you is to stop the rush of work long enough to offer something to God. So no matter how observant you are, no matter how orthodox, and no matter how much you are part of the capitalist engine, you still have to take time out. But the other part of this is in Judaism, you need a quorum of at least 10 men to gather in prayer. You should not pray on your own if you're a man. Uh,
really.
yes,
Hmm.
it's how Judaism builds community, at least among men. If you're a woman, you can pray by yourself, and you're also not obligated to pray. And those are complicated, thorny issues, but um, the idea that 10 men would gather to pray in New York necessitated this underground um, network of places that are actually businesses. They're all businesses that transform into sacred spaces for an hour each day. And so that transformation, the floating, invisible synagogue, was fascinating to me. And as you guessed, it was very, very difficult to get access, particularly in the days after September 11, where this very guarded, um, hermetic community was even more so. And but I was persistent, and I tried to be discreet, and it paid off, and I was able to shoot the project.
Hmm. I actually really, I don't know what the word is, but I really appreciate what you say about the fascination with the idea that for an hour, and I mean, this is what really grips me about these photographs, is like you're in a warehouse basically, and for an hour, it's a sacred space.
Hmm.
And I think about that like cumulatively over time. Can you feel that? Is there a resonance for someone walking in who's not aware of that? Like, I
Hmm.
wonder, that's my question I have. If I walk in there, would I ever know that? Or would I be oblivious to it? You
I
know?
think you would, but then again, um, it's they generally compartmentalize it so that
Mm.
the prayer circle meets, like in this case, in the staircase of a button store in Soho. a store that is not there anymore, by the way. And that's part of what makes photography photography. Is also a document of what New York City used to be.
Mm.
There was a beautiful button store in Soho with thousands and thousands of buttons that
I remember
people, you
it.
remember that place, right? So you've been there. And in the staircase, it's sometimes down the stairs, people would congregate to pray.
Mm.
So if you happen to go down the staircase, you would disrupt something and you would know it.
Yeah. Yeah, thinking about how you talking, about the way New York City has been transformed in not a good way, and who's going to do that in Starbucks, right?
Right.
Maybe, but I don't think so. Yeah. I remember when you did this project and it was like, oh, these pictures for me, they're like my eyes feel greedy for them. Like I want to know what's
Wow.
going on in these secret places.
Wow. Wow. I love to hear that. This was an interesting spot, an electronics store, and of course, the boxes in the storage room changed every so often. They would move a couple of fridges out of the way, or they would bring in more TVs or whatever. So the configuration changed every time you went. But that was the configuration this day, and of course, you feel the way the guy in the foreground wearing that the hat, he's leading the service. And if you've been to a Jewish synagogue that's called the bima, it's usually raised. You have to climb a few stairs if you're going to lead the service, and the stairs are not there, but invisibly I feel him stepping up.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm. Mm.
Yeah, and I was more attracted to these kind of spaces, that really this is a paper supplier, and it goes back to being a, a warehouse after Minha is over. So I photographed a few synagogues as well,
Mm-hmm.
because of course they have prayer circles too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the photographer in me was a lot more interested in this kind of situation.
Yeah, I mean, this big picture is so incredible. Yeah. It's actually the last one. It's the last
Okay.
one.
Well, it was such a pleasure, Arvin.
Ooh, thank you. Thank you. So, I feel like I have kept you a long time, but before we close, and I'll turn off the recording, I don't know if there's any final thought or um, something just.
Well, I would just like to thank your audience for tuning in as well. And if people want to see more of my work, they can go to my website. My newest project is entitled The Street Becomes, and that grew out of an artist in residence at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And the book will be published this April, in mid-April, by Meteoro Editions in Amsterdam. So I'm really excited about that and looking forward to seeing that in print. And I'm also working on a project that is so close to my heart, so different from anything I've done before, because it focuses on a single individual, and that one is called Olmerini el Mago, and it follows an 80-year-old blind magician who makes a living in the subways of New York. So if people are curious, the work is up on the website, and you can also drop me a line from the website.